The wind howled through Bitter Creek like a wounded animal on the night Victoria Garland stumbled into town, her face so battered and bruised that the moonlight seemed to flinch away from her. Blood matted her auburn hair to her skull, and her once fine dress hung in tatters around her trembling form. She had walked nearly 15 miles from the Holloway Ranch, each step a defiance against the man who had tried to break her spirit along with her body. Victoria collapsed just outside Mabel's boarding house, the last of her strength abandoning her as thunder rolled across the Montana sky. The year was 1876, and in this unforgiving corner of the frontier, a woman alone might as well be wearing a target. Good Lord above! Mabel Taylor exclaimed, opening her door to find the crumpled form on her steps. "Someone help! There's a woman dying on my porch." Several townsfolk rushed forward, but it was Forrest Lawson who reached her first. The tall cowboy with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer storm knelt beside the unconscious woman, his calloused hands gentle as they checked for a pulse. "She's alive," he announced, scooping Victoria into his arms as if she weighed nothing more than a child. "But just barely." "Bring her inside," Mabel directed, already clearing space in her parlor. "I'll fetch Doc Wilson." Victoria's eyelids fluttered as Forrest carried her through the doorway. For a brief moment, hazel eyes met blue fear meeting compassion before darkness claimed her again. Doc Wilson arrived within minutes, his medical bag clutched in one weathered hand. At 63, he had seen more than his share of frontier violence, but something about the systematic nature of this woman's injuries made even his seasoned stomach turn. "Someone meant to kill her," he said quietly as he worked to clean and dress her wounds. "This wasn't just a beating, it was an execution that failed." Forrest stood at the window, his jaw clenched so tight it might have been carved from granite. At 32, he had been riding the range for half his life, had fought in the war between the states, and had seen men die in ways that still haunted his dreams. But this, the deliberate destruction of a woman, stirred something primal inside him. "Will she live?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion he refused to examine too closely. The doctor sighed. "Her body might. The rest." He shook his head. "Sometimes the wounds we can't see take the longest to heal." For 3 days, Victoria drifted in and out of consciousness. Mabel and several other women from town took turns sitting with her, cooling her fever-hot skin with damp cloths and trickling water between her cracked lips. Forrest found excuses to stop by the boarding house, though he had no real business there. On the 4th day, she finally opened her eyes and remained lucid. "Where am I?" Her voice was barely a whisper, like autumn leaves scraping across hard-packed dirt. "You're safe at Mabel's boarding house in Bitter Creek," the older woman explained, helping Victoria sip some broth. "You've been through quite an ordeal, my dear." Victoria's hand moved to her face, fingers tracing the contours of swelling and stitches. A tear slid down her cheek, cutting a path through the fading bruises. "They'll heal," Mabel said gently. "You'll have some scars, maybe, but you're young." 22, 23, 24, Victoria murmured, "though I feel ancient now." Word of the mysterious injured woman spread through Bitter Creek like wildfire. Speculation ran rampant about who she was and what had happened to her. When Sheriff Patterson finally came to question her, Victoria's story emerged in halting fragments. She had been a schoolteacher in St. Louis before answering an advertisement for a governess position at the Holloway Ranch. The widowed rancher, Edmund Holloway, had seemed kind at first until she arrived and discovered his true nature. His 3 children needed education less than they needed protection from their father's drunken rages. "He proposed marriage 2 weeks after I arrived," Victoria said, her eyes fixed on a point beyond the sheriff's shoulder. When I refused, he decided to take what he wanted anyway. She had fought back that much was evident from the defensive wounds on her arms, but Holloway and his foreman had overwhelmed her. They would have killed me if his daughter hadn't created a distraction, she finished. I ran. I just ran and kept running. Sheriff Patterson's expression was grim. Holloway has influence in these parts, Miss Garland. His cattle operation employs half the county. Are you saying you won't help her? Forrest's voice cut through the room like a knife. No one had noticed him standing in the doorway, hat in hand. The sheriff sighed. I'm saying it might be best if Miss Garland moved on once she's recovered, for her own safety. Victoria's shoulders slumped further if that was possible. Another door closing, another place where justice would remain out of reach. No, Forrest said, stepping fully into the room. That's not right, and you know it, Sheriff. Holloway needs to answer for what he's done. And who's going to make him? Patterson challenged. You, a hired hand with no property and no standing. Forrest straightened to his full height, which topped the sheriff by several inches. If necessary. Victoria looked between the two men, confusion mingling with a spark of something that might have been hope. I don't want anyone else getting hurt because of me, she said softly. Sometimes standing by and doing nothing causes more hurt in the long run, Forrest replied, his eyes meeting hers across the room. I've learned that lesson the hard way. After the sheriff left, muttering about foolhardy cowboys with more courage than sense, Mabel brought Victoria another cup of broth. That's Forrest Lawson, she explained. Works cattle for the Harper spread north of town. Known him since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. Good man. Stubborn as they come. He doesn't even know me, Victoria said, bewildered by the stranger's willingness to champion her cause. Mabel's smile was knowing. Some folks don't need lengthy introductions to recognize when something's not right in the world. Forrest has always been one of those. Over the next 2 weeks, as Victoria's body began the slow process of healing, Forrest became a regular visitor. At first, their conversations were stilted and awkward. He would bring small gifts, a book from the general store, wildflowers picked on the ride to town, a carved wooden bird that he claimed was supposed to be a meadowlark but looked more like a lumpy potato with wings. I never claimed to be an artist, he said with a self-deprecating smile when she laughed at his creation. That laugh, her first since arriving in Bitter Creek, seemed to crack something open between them. Victoria began to look forward to his visits, to the way he would tell her about his day working cattle, or his childhood growing up with 5 sisters in a small cabin in Tennessee. They dressed me up like a doll until I was old enough to run away, he confessed, grinning at the memory. Ma has pictures somewhere. If you ever meet her, promise you won't ask to see them. The casual reference to a future where she might meet his family caught them both by surprise. Forrest cleared his throat and changed the subject, but the moment lingered between them like a promise. As Victoria regained her strength, whispers followed her through town. Some called her that poor broken thing in tones dripping with pity. Others were less charitable, suggesting she must have done something to provoke Holloway's rage. A few even insinuated she was fabricating or exaggerating her ordeal to garner sympathy. On her first Sunday attending the local church, Victoria overheard 2 women talking just outside the entrance. Damaged goods, that's what she is, one whispered to the other. No decent man will want her now that she's broken. Victoria froze, the words striking deeper than any physical blow. She had been standing straighter that morning, feeling almost like herself again in a borrowed dress that Mabel had altered to fit her slender frame. Now she felt herself shrinking, folding inward as if to protect what remained of her heart. A warm presence appeared at her side, and then Forrest's hand was at the small of her back, steadying her. "Good morning, ladies," he said, his voice carrying just enough to ensure others turned to look. "Miss Garland, may I escort you inside? I saved us seats." The gossips' mouths fell open as Forrest guided Victoria past them, his head held high and his expression daring anyone to comment further. Inside the church, he led her to a pew near the front, nodding politely to acquaintances as they passed. "You didn't have to do that," Victoria whispered once they were seated. "I know," he replied simply. "I wanted to." After the service, several people approached Victoria to introduce themselves properly, their earlier reticence melting in the face of Forrest's obvious endorsement. By the time they left the church, Victoria had received invitations to a quilting circle and offers of sewing work from 2 different families. "Thank you," she said as they walked back toward Mabel's, "for standing beside me." Forrest's expression turned serious. "They called you broken back there, those women." Victoria looked away, embarrassment heating her cheeks. "You heard that?" "I did." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "And it's not true. Wounded, yes. Healing, yes, but not broken, never that." "Sometimes I feel broken," she admitted in a whisper. "Like I'll never be whole again." Forrest's hand reached for hers, hesitating just before contact as if asking permission. When she didn't pull away, he gently took her fingers in his. "Then I'll help you mend," he said, the simple declaration carrying the weight of a vow. "However long it takes." Their moment was interrupted by the thundering approach of hooves. 6 riders entered Bitter Creek's main street, dust clouds billowing behind them. At their head rode Edmund Holloway, his face flushed with either rage or whiskey, perhaps both. "Where is she?" he bellowed, reining his horse to a stop before the sheriff's office. "Where's the lying whore who's spreading tales about me?" Forrest stepped in front of Victoria, shielding her with his body. "Get to Mabel's," he murmured. "Lock the door." "I won't run again," Victoria said, though her voice trembled. "I can't spend my life running." Sheriff Patterson emerged from his office, rifle in hand. "Holloway, this is not how we handle matters in my town." The rancher sneered. "Your town? This whole territory might as well have my name on the deed. Now hand over the woman. She stole from me before she ran." "That's a lie," Victoria called out, stepping around Forrest despite his attempt to keep her behind him. "The only thing I took was my life, which you tried to end." Murmurs rippled through the growing crowd of onlookers. Holloway's eyes narrowed as he spotted Victoria, his gaze taking in her healing face. "Look at her," he said, addressing the townspeople. "Making a spectacle of herself, clinging to this cowboy. She tried the same with me, led me on, and then cried foul when I expected what she'd been promising." Forrest's hands clenched into fists. "That's enough, Holloway." "Or what?" The rancher laughed, the sound ugly and sharp. "You'll call me out. A no-account cowpoke against the biggest landowner in 3 counties. Even if you somehow won, you'd hang before sundown." Victoria placed her hand on Forrest's arm, feeling the tension thrumming through him. "He's not worth it," she said quietly. "My word against his will never be enough." But it wasn't just her word anymore. A small figure darted out from between 2 buildings, a girl of about 12 with Holloway's dark eyes and her mother's delicate features. "Sarah." Holloway's voice cracked with surprise. "What in God's name are you doing here?" "I came to make sure Miss Garland was all right," the girl said, her chin lifted in defiance that belied her years. "After what you and Mr. Denton did to her." The crowd's murmurs grew louder. A child's testimony, especially a man's own daughter, carried weight that a compromised woman's might not. "This is absurd," Holloway blustered. The girl's confused, imagining things. "I'm not confused, Pa," Sarah continued, moving to stand beside Victoria. "I saw everything." I heard Miss Garland say no. I saw Mr. Denton hold her down while you hit her. I saw you drag her to the barn." Sheriff Patterson stepped forward, his expression grave. "That's quite an accusation, little lady." "It's the truth," Sarah insisted, "and I'm not the only one who knows it. Ask any of the ranch hands about Miss Garland's screams that night. Ask Mrs. Holcomb, who helped wash the blood from the floorboards." Victoria knelt beside the brave child, tears streaming down her face. "You shouldn't have followed me," she whispered. "He'll be furious with you now." "I don't care," Sarah replied. "You taught us about courage, remember? About standing up for what's right even when it's hard." With Sarah's testimony altering the balance of power, Sheriff Patterson finally found his courage. He arrested Holloway on the spot, though the rancher continued to protest his innocence and threaten everyone involved with ruination. "What about the children?" Victoria asked as Patterson led Holloway away. "Sarah and her brothers. My aunt is in Helena," Sarah offered. "She's been trying to get Pa to let us visit for years. She'd take us in." That night, with Holloway locked in the town jail awaiting trial and his children safely installed at Mabel's boarding house, Victoria sat on the front porch swing, watching the stars emerge. Forrest joined her, offering a cup of tea which she accepted gratefully. "What happens now?" she asked after several minutes of comfortable silence. "Now you decide," Forrest replied. "You could stay in Bitter Creek. Mabel mentioned the town needs a teacher for next year." Victoria considered this, and if Holloway is released, or if his friends seek revenge, then I'll be right here, he said simply. "Beside you." The trial of Edmund Holloway became the talk of the territory. Victoria testified with quiet dignity, recounting the horrors she had endured without flinching. Sarah's testimony brought tears to the eyes of even the most stoic jurors. When the ranch hands and housekeeper confirmed the girl's account, Holloway's fate was sealed. He was sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, a victory for justice that few had thought possible. As the former rancher was led away in chains, Victoria felt not triumph but a profound sense of relief. One chapter of her life had closed. Another could now begin. The town council officially offered her the position of schoolteacher, and Mabel helped her find a small cabin to rent on the edge of town. Slowly, painfully, Victoria built a new life for herself in Bitter Creek. Through it all, Forrest remained a constant presence, never pushing, never presuming, but always there when she needed him. He helped repair her cabin's leaking roof, chopped firewood for the coming winter, and brought her small treasures from his rides across the territory. The first time he kissed her was on a crisp autumn evening nearly 6 months after her arrival in Bitter Creek. They had been walking back from a town social, the harvest moon illuminating their path. "I've been wanting to do that for a while," he admitted afterward, his forehead resting against hers. "Why didn't you?" she asked, her hand still clutching the front of his shirt. His smile was tender. "Some things are worth waiting for. I needed you to be ready, to know that you had choices." Victoria's heart swelled with an emotion she had almost forgotten she could feel. "I choose you," she whispered. "I've been choosing you a little more each day." Their courtship proceeded at a deliberate pace. Victoria needed time to trust again, to believe that a man's hands could bring pleasure instead of pain. Forrest gave her that time, never rushing, never demanding more than she was ready to give. When he finally proposed the following spring, he did so with a ring fashioned from a silver dollar his father had given him before the war. "It's not fancy," he apologized, "but neither am I. What I can promise you is that I'll work every day to deserve your trust, to help you keep mending and to mend alongside you when I'm the one who's hurting." Victoria's answer was to pull him close and kiss him with all the passion she had once feared was lost to her forever. They married in June of 1877, with wildflowers decorating the small church and the entire town in attendance. Mabel wept openly, claiming allergies when anyone commented on her tears. Sheriff Patterson gave the bride away, his gruff exterior softening for the occasion. Forrest had saved enough to put a down payment on a modest ranch of his own, nothing like Holloway's spread, but enough to build a future on. The night he carried Victoria across the threshold of their new home, she felt the final pieces of her heart clicking back into place. "Welcome home, Mrs. Lawson," he said, setting her gently on her feet in their front room. Victoria looked around at the simple furnishings, the curtains Mabel had helped her sew, the quilt from Forrest's mother adorning their marriage bed. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. That night, as Forrest's hands traced reverent patterns across her skin, Victoria finally understood what it meant to be truly mended. The scars remained always would, but they had become part of her story rather than its conclusion. Their first child, a daughter they named Hope, arrived the following spring. Forrest paced outside their bedroom while the midwife attended Victoria, his face pale with worry until the newborn's lusty cry pierced the air. "She has your strength," he whispered when Victoria placed their daughter in his arms, "and your beauty." "And your stubbornness, I suspect," Victoria replied with a tired smile. "God help us all." As the years passed, their family and ranch grew together. A son joined them 2 years after Hope, followed by twin girls who kept them running from dawn till dusk with their mischief. The Lawson Ranch became known for its fine horses and warm hospitality, a place where travelers could always find a hot meal and honest conversation. Victoria never forgot her past, how could she, with scars that still showed when she turned her face just so in the light. But neither did she allow it to define her future. She started a small school on their property for neighboring children too far from town to attend regularly. Her reputation as a teacher who could reach even the most reluctant students spread throughout the county. Forrest watched his wife bloom with pride so intense it sometimes felt like pain. On their 10th anniversary, he presented her with a journal bound in soft leather. "For your stories," he explained. "The ones you tell the children at night, they should be written down, shared beyond our 4 walls." Victoria's hand trembled as she accepted the gift. "You think others would want to read them? I know they would." His faith in her had never wavered, not once in all their years together. She began writing that very night, filling pages with tales of brave girls who outwitted villains, of kind-hearted cowboys who recognized true strength when they saw it, of communities that stood together against those who would abuse power. When her first collection of stories was published in 1890, the dedication reads simply, "For Forrest, who helped me mend." Life on the frontier was never easy. They weathered droughts that threatened their herds, winters harsh enough to freeze cattle where they stood, and economic downturns that tested their resourcefulness. Through it all, they faced each challenge together, their partnership only strengthening with each obstacle overcome. When news reached them that Edmund Holloway had died in prison, Victoria felt a strange hollowness where she had expected either satisfaction or lingering fear. "He has no power over you anymore," Forrest said that night as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of copper and gold. "He never really did," Victoria nodded, leaning against her husband's solid warmth. "I stopped being afraid of him years ago. I just didn't realize it until now." Sarah Holloway, now Sarah Mitchell with a family of her own in Helena, wrote occasionally with news. She had become an advocate for women's rights, using her own experiences to argue for stronger legal protections. Victoria saved every letter, proud of the woman her former student had become. As their children grew and began to forge their own paths, Forrest and Victoria found new rhythms to their days. They still worked side by side, their bodies marked by the years but still strong. At night, they still reached for each other with a passion that had matured like fine wine rather than diminishing. On their 30th anniversary, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and friends who had become family, Victoria found herself watching Forrest across the room. His hair had silvered, lines fanned from the corners of his eyes, but when he looked at her, she still saw the cowboy who had carried her broken body into Mabel's boarding house all those years ago. He caught her gaze and crossed the room to her side, taking her hand in his. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Lawson." "I was just thinking about promises kept," she replied, squeezing his fingers. "About mending and being mended." Forrest's smile deepened the creases around his mouth. "Best work I ever did." "We did it together," Victoria corrected gently. "That was always the true healing, finding someone who saw me as whole, even when I couldn't see it myself." Their grandson interrupted with demands for a story, and Victoria settled the boy on her lap, beginning the tale he loved best of a brave young woman who fled through the night, of a cowboy who recognized her worth beyond her wounds, of a community that ultimately chose justice over power. She told it without mentioning that the story was her own. Someday, when the children were older, perhaps they would recognize the truth woven through her words. For now, it was enough that they understood its heart, that broken things could be mended, that love was an act of faith renewed each day, and that true strength often came disguised as vulnerability. Later, as the celebration wound down and their guests departed into the Montana twilight, Forrest and Victoria stood on their porch, his arm around her waist as they watched the first stars appear. 30 years, he mused. Would you do it all again? Victoria thought about the pain that had led her to Bitter Creek, the long journey of healing, the life they had built from shattered beginnings. "Every moment," she said without hesitation, "even the worst parts, because they led me to you." Forrest turned her in his arms, his hand still strong despite the years framing her face with familiar tenderness. "You know, when I found you that night, folks said you were broken beyond repair. And you said you'd help me mend," Victoria finished, the memory as clear as if it had happened yesterday rather than 3 decades past. "Best promise I ever made," he murmured against her lips. "And I intend to keep it for at least 30 more years." Victoria laughed, the sound free and unencumbered by shadows. "That would make us ancient." "Maybe," Forrest agreed, pulling her closer as the evening chill settled around them. "But we'd be ancient together, and still mending each other one day at a time." As they turned to go inside, Victoria cast one last look at the vast Montana sky, at the land that had witnessed both her greatest suffering and her most profound joy. The scars that marked her body and soul had long since ceased to be reminders of what she had lost. Instead, they had become testament to what she had found: strength she hadn't known she possessed, love she hadn't dared to hope for, and a life richer than any she could have imagined on that desperate night when she had run for her life. Some called her broken. He had helped her mend. Together, they had created something stronger and more beautiful than either could have crafted alone. And that, Victoria knew as she followed her husband into the warmth of their home, was the truest definition of healing: not the absence of scars, but the presence of love that transformed them into something precious.